With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Welcome into the program, everybody. Happy 4th of July. I'm very excited about our big 4th of July special. If you've been my fan for a while, you know we always make a really big deal of our Independence Day special. So we are here live on Independence Day. That's right. I'm working through the holidays for you. You're welcome. But no, seriously, we always take 4th of July really serious. You see that I've got the big patriotic background here. I've got the Captain America shield. By the way, this is a real Captain America shield. This isn't graphics or anything I piped in. I actually own a Captain America shield. Partly because I'm a proud American, partly because I'm a huge nerd. Even got my Captain America cup today, so you can see that. Buddy gave that to me a while back. Actually, the same person that does my graphics, so... tastes like freedom. Anyway, usually I have a different cup, but I've got my Captain America cup today just because it is, of course, Independence Day, and I'm really excited. I'm going to go do the most American thing anybody can do, go to a baseball game. So I'm headed to the Montgomery Biscuits right after this, going to be watching the fireworks display and everything, but before we do any of that, we do have our Independence Day special that we are incredibly pleased to bring you. So, I thought that we'd do something kind of different today, and I've actually read the Declaration of Independence on the air before, but not this Declaration of Independence. Not the one that I have hanging up on my wall over there, which you can't see because I only have one camera. I'm talking about this Declaration of Independence that most people don't even know exists. And you may be sitting there scratching your head thinking, Caleb, how can there be more than one Declaration of Independence? The Declaration of Independence is what it is. Well, yes, but it's important to understand how the Declaration of Independence came about and the reason that we celebrate today as Independence Day, because we don't celebrate the day that we founded the federal government. We don't celebrate the day that we signed the Constitution. We don't celebrate the day that it was ratified. We don't celebrate the day that we came up with the Bill of Rights and ratified them. 2 separate days. We celebrate the day that we declared our independence from Great Britain. Why? We had no formal government. We were still at war. We weren't technically independent in the sense that anybody from the outside looking in would have said, well, until they win the war, they're still the colonies that belong to Britain. So why is July the 4th Independence Day, and how did that document come about? Well, it's important to note that the states came together with their representatives, understanding that they needed to declare independence from Great Britain, but they weren't exactly sure how to do that. Keep in mind, they were in completely uncharted waters. They had never done anything like this, nor had anybody else in human history. And so they got together and they talked it out and they said, we need principles. We need to explain to Britain why we're severing this relationship and why you need to let us go and be our own country. And they all had a general idea and they were all sort of in general agreement. And they did have those binding principles, but what they decided is we need somebody to write them down to make sure everything's included. It must be done with the unanimous consent of all 13 colonies. And once we have that drafted, we'll look at it and debate about a few parts about it, and then we'll send it off to England and let them know that we're independent. Keep in mind, the war had already started at this point. There were already skirmishes that predate 1776 by almost a year. And so when you're looking at this, when you're looking at the history of this document, who came up with that? Well, you had a committee of 5 people, including John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson, being well known as an amazing writer, and he was given the task of writing down the rough draft. And when he did, it was the committee of 5 that kind of looked over it, tweaked it, made some edits here or there. But the original draft, that the final Declaration of Independence that we're all familiar with, the original draft came from Jefferson and Jefferson alone. It was just him. There was nobody else that had any input. The committee came up with the declaration that we're now familiar with after, making some tweaks here and there and that kind of thing. And there were several different contrasts that you're going to notice when I read this. This is Jefferson's rough draft. This is not from the mind of anybody else. This wasn't formed in a committee or debated. This is just what Jefferson believes. And so you'll notice that there are a handful of contrasts. Some are basically just wording that they made it a little more concise. And then some of them are actually a pretty significant departure from the original Declaration of Independence. All the same sentiment and principles are there, but they're a little bit more fleshed out in this version of the Declaration of Independence. So here it goes. A declaration of the representatives of the United States of America in general, Congress assembled. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for a people to advance from that subordination in which they have hitherto remained, and to assume among the powers of the earth the equal and independent station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the change. We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal and independent, that from that equal creation they derive rights inherent and inalienable, among which are the preservation of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these ends, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government shall become destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves in abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations began at a distinguished period, and pursuing invariably the same object, evidences designed to subject them to arbitrary power, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government and provide new guards for their future security, such as has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to expunge their former systems of government. The history of this present majesty is a history of unremitting injuries and usurpations, among which no one fact stands single or solitary to contradict the uniform tenor of rest, all of which have in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world, for the truth of which we pledge a faith yet unsullied by falsehood. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has neglected utterly to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish their right of representation, a right inestimable to them, formidable to tyrants alone. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly and continually for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long space of time to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers incapable of an annihilation have returned to people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws and naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrants hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. He has suffered the administration of justice totally to cease in some of these colonies, refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made our judges dependent on his will alone, for the tenure of their offices and amount of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices by self-assumed power, and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out of their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies and ships of war. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to jurisdiction foreign to our constitutions and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their pretended acts of legislation for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by mock trial from punishment for any murders they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us of the benefits of a trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretend offenses, for taking away our charters and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here, withdrawing his governors and declaring us out of his allegiance and protection. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coast, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has endeavored to bring the inhabitants, our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is undistinguished and destruction for all ages, sexes, and conditions of existence. He has incited treasonable insurrections in our fellow subjects, with the allurements of forfeiture and confiscation of our property. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This practical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep an open market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce. And this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye. He is now exciting those very people to rise in arms against us, and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them, and murdering people upon whom he also obtruded them, thus paying off the former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress, the most humble terms, Our repeated petitions have been answered repeated injury, a prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be ruler of a people who mean to be free. Future ages will scarce believe that the hardiness of one man adventured within the short compass of the 12 years only on so many acts of tyranny without a mask over a people fostered and fixed in principles of liberty. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend jurisdiction over these, our states. We have reminded them that the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here, no one of which could have warrant so strange a partition, that these were effected at the expense of our own blood and treasure, unassisted by the wealth or the strength of Great Britain, in that, constituting indeed our several forms of government, we had adopted one common king, thereby laying a foundation for perpetual league and amity with them, but that submission to their parliament was no part of our constitution, nor ever in idea, if history may be credited, and we appealed to their narrative justice and magnanimity, as well to the ties of our common kindred, to disavow these usurpations, which were likely to interrupt our correspondence and connection. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and consanguinity, and when occasions have been given them, by the regular course of their laws, of removing from their councils the distributors of our harmony, they have by their free election re-established them in power, and this very time too they are permitting their chief magistrate to send over not only soldiers of our common blood, but Scotch and foreign mercenaries to invade and delude us in blood. These facts have given the last stab to an agonizing affection, and manly spirits bid us to renounce forever these unfleeting brethren. We must endeavor to forget our former love for them, and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We might have been a free and great people together, but a communication of grandeur and of freedom, it seems, is below their dignity. Be it so, since they will have it. The road to glory and happiness is open to us, too. We will climb in it in a separate state, and acquiesce in the necessity which pronounces our everlasting adieu. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress, assembled, do in the name and by the authority of good people of these states, reject and renounce all allegiance and subjection to the kings of Great Britain and all others may hereafter claim by, though, or under them. We utterly dissolve and break off all political connection, which may have heretofore subsisted between us and the people of the Parliament of Great Britain. And finally, we do assert and declare these colonies to be free and independent states, and that as free and independent states, they shall hereafter have power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in just a minute.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Community Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. Now it's time for a reading from the SJW Bible. Today's reading will come from Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took their respective fire pans, and after putting the fire in them, placed incense on it and offered strange fire before the Lord. which he had not commanded them. And the fire came out of the presence of the Lord, which created a wicked cool light show for them to see, and totally got everyone feeling the Spirit's presence. Then Moses said to Aaron, "It is what the Lord spoke, saying, even though I didn't command you to use this strange fire, I totally understand your need to express yourselves in worship and keep yourselves entertained." So Aaron therefore danced and yelled with joy, knowing that his sons were having a good time at worship. Moses called out to Mishael and Ezaphan, and the son of Aaron's uncle Uzziel, and said to them, "Come forward, carry your relatives away in front of the sanctuary outside of the camp, for they have fainted from being overwhelmed by the power of God's coolness." So they came forward and carried them still in their tunics outside the camp, as Moses had said. Then Moses said to Aaron and his sons Eleazar and Ithamar, "Do not uncover your heads, nor tear your clothes, because God wants us to always be happy, and as long as we're happy, He's happy. Therefore, if worship doesn't give you an overwhelming sense of euphoria, you need to find another congregation, preferably one with a more dynamic pastor and band." So they did according to the word of Moses. And the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, "Do not drink wine or strong drink, neither you nor your sons with you, when you come into the sanctuary, so that you will be able to drink more once you arrive. It is a perpetual statute throughout your generations. And so as to make a distinction between the holy and the profane, between the unclean and the clean, because when worship stops being fun or feels judgy, then it becomes profane and unclean." Wow, so inspiring. This has been a reading from the SJW Bible. And remember, the only truth that matters is your truth.
And welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us here on Independence Day. America is 423 as of today. Certainly something to be quite ecstatic about, as I am. I got to say, other than maybe Thanksgiving, I think Thanksgiving is probably my favorite holiday, but Independence Day would have to be my second. I mean, it's everything that you would want in a holiday. Really cool fireworks, baseball, and food. I mean, what else could you ask for? And not just food, specifically American food. Burgers, hot dogs, steak. I know that steak wasn't really invented by us, but whatever, steak, barbecue. I mean, it's just, gosh, I just love it so much. And I hope that you enjoy it too. I hope that you have a great time with your family. But I do also want you to think about the reason that we celebrate this holiday in the first place. And I try to do that every year, try to sort of recenter us and help us to remember what is really important about this holiday, because of course it's a great time to spend with your family. It's a great day to remember and to be thankful for the liberties we have in the greatest nation in human history. But there's more than just that. Obviously, that's a big part of it. And obviously, I want everybody to have a good time and to be safe with their family and to get to see some cool fireworks. But like I just read, in the draft of the Declaration of Independence that was written by Thomas Jefferson, and of course in the eventual Declaration of Independence that was the final draft that was put together by him and Adams and Franklin, I want you to all remember what is really underneath all of that, because our Constitution is great. Nothing wrong with the Constitution. You guys know how much I love the Constitution and talk about it all the time. But the Declaration of Independence, which is what we're celebrating today, that's the principles underneath it. Because the Constitution by itself, without the Bill of Rights, is just a form of government. It's a great form of government, but it's still just a form of government. Using that vehicle, you could go anywhere. Using the vehicle of the Constitution, you could get to the freest and most prosperous nation in human history, and you could also get to a Soviet state. You could also get to a dictatorship with massive human rights violations where people have no liberty at all. You see, it's just the vehicle. And then the Bill of Rights are sort of stopgaps. They're shackles on the federal government to try to make sure that it doesn't do that. But the Constitution by itself, all it is a vehicle. All it does is get you there. It doesn't tell you where to go or how to drive. And so the Bill of Rights sort of works as a stopgap, sort of a safety mechanism to keep the government from going awry. But the most important one, in my opinion, is the Declaration of Independence. Why? Because it tells you where we're supposed to go. You see, all the things that we went through there, and a big chunk of the Declaration of Independence, which unfortunately most Americans don't even read anymore, a big chunk of it is all the horrible things that Britain did to America that resulted in the revolution. It wasn't just they got tired of sipping tea every day at 4 o'clock and didn't like the British flag and they were like, okay, we're out of here. And it wasn't even just about the taxation without representation, even though that became the battle cry. There were a lot of problems between these two now nations. And what's important to understand about that is there was a long laundry list of an usurpation of their rights, where the king had specifically and intentionally undermined the rights of his own citizens to the point where they felt like the only way they were going to get their God-given human rights back was to rebel and create their own country. And that's exactly what they did, and that's what we celebrate today. We celebrate that a few very brave men pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to a greater cause. That they saw these injustices happening and they said, no, we will stand up. And if the only way, even though we don't want to do it, and that's actually repeated several times in the Declaration of Independence, even though we don't actually want to sever this relationship, we wanted to live in peace. We wanted to have our rights as citizens. That's what we wanted to do. But because over and over again, Britain has continued to violate our rights, well, it appears as though the only way that we are going to get those rights back is if we take charge and we make our own nation. And we will make a nation that respects these rights. You see, everything that's in the Bill of Rights, did you notice that you could take each one of those Bill of Rights and go back to the Declaration of Independence and find the rationale behind it? You can find the principle that's there. Britain was taking away their independence as states. So you get the 10th Amendment. Britain was waging war against them. So you get the Second Amendment. Britain was silencing people they didn't like and quartering people in their houses to spy on their political enemies and take out the people they didn't like. Ergo, the First Amendment. And so it really does show that the Declaration of Independence was America's roadmap. Now, we came up with other tools on how to get to the destination the map showed us to, but it all goes back to the Declaration. That's what shows us who we are as a country and where we're supposed to be going. Without the map, we don't have anywhere to go. I mean, it's great to have a good car, but the nicest car in the world doesn't really do you any good if you don't have a map or don't know where you want to go. And so that's why the Declaration of Independence is so incredibly important. And I'm ashamed that we are losing that. That the average person doesn't know anything about the Declaration of Independence. They might be able to quote a sentence fragment out of one of the lines, say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They might be able to say that. But the real meat and potatoes, when you delve into the Declaration of Independence, it's so rich. And it makes so much of our history make sense if you'll just take the time to sit down and read it. And that was the longer version of it that we just read, and it still only took about 15 minutes. It doesn't take that long to read this stuff, and you could find somebody like me that read it online for you. You don't even have to physically sit down and read it. You can listen to someone else read it. But if you want to know why we're having problems in this country, if you want to know why we're having the division that we are, it all goes back to we are not living up to the principles that were put out there for us in the Declaration of Independence. Every problem that we're having in this country, just about it. Maybe there are a few exceptions that I can't think of right now. Maybe there are. But if you're looking at all the hot button topics, those all go away if we just live by the principles in the Declaration of Independence. If we just held that up as our standard, we would be fine. But we're not doing that. And that's really where the problem lies. And The problem with this is, and I think that it's a vicious cycle. I don't think that you can say, okay, well, they're coming after our history and they're trying to destroy our history, and that's why people don't know their history anymore. And you can't say people don't know their history anymore, and that's why they're destroying our history. I think it's a vicious cycle. I think it's impossible to tell exactly where this cause and effect thing happened, even though I know that it's not really a conundrum. It's kind of the chicken or the egg thing. You see, they're able to destroy the history because people don't know the history well enough to say, no, that's stupid, you've got your history wrong. But they're destroying it little by little, and the more they destroy it little by little, the less people know about it because the less people are interested in looking at the history because they believe our country is broken. And so you wind up in this vicious cycle to where we're constantly going in a downward spiral. That people get less interested in history because they believe that the founders are all a bunch of evil, white nationalist hate mongers, and because of that, their work isn't really worth reading anyway. And because more people believe that, less people learn about them, and the easier it is to sell that lie. To sell this idea that America is broken from the onset, and sort of to illustrate that. Because I don't think the story in and of itself is that important. I think what the story represents and the sentiment underlying the players in this story is important. And there is an important lesson to learn here. And what I'm talking about is there was a story that happened earlier this week, and it's just another example of this. And we're actually going to cover two stories that are kind of similar. It turns out that Charlottesville is no longer going to celebrate Thomas Jefferson's birthday. This was announced, I believe, early this week, Monday, if I'm not mistaken. And they used to have a holiday, the city of Charlottesville. It wasn't a federal holiday or a state holiday, but the city of Charlottesville had a special event for Thomas Jefferson's birthday to celebrate the man, Thomas Jefferson, who wrote our Declaration of Independence. Celebrate his life, his accomplishments. And now, Charlottesville, which is an increasingly liberal city, it's kind of like Austin, Texas. That's a pretty good parallel to draw here. And if you know anything about the culture of either Charlottesville or Austin, Texas, what happened is a bunch of more liberal, progressive-minded people moved there to escape the high taxes, and because of that, it became a much more liberal city even than it already was. Now, cities, especially large cities, as a general rule, have been liberal for a long time now, even in the South. I mean, if you're listening to me here in the capital city of Montgomery, you understand that Montgomery's pretty liberal and tends to vote Democrat, but Wetumpka and Prattville and Millbrook and all the surrounding areas are very Republican. But anyway, Austin and Charlottesville have this similar sort of motif, I guess, that when they had this influx of liberals which tended to make the city more liberal, and they've developed this sort of inside very conservative red states, this sort of very liberal counterculture to where it's not quite, Seattle or LA, but the cultural scene is not that different from it. And Charlottesville and Austin have been specifically seen as more liberal cities even than, other cities in Texas like Houston and Dallas, that kind of thing. So Austin's kind of seen as Texas's liberal city, and the same goes for Charlottesville in North Carolina. So Charlottesville has now announced that they are not going to celebrate Thomas Jefferson's birthday. And I mean, it's blatant virtue signaling, because what they're doing is they're not just nixing Jefferson's birthday. They're specifically nixing it and replacing it with what they call Emancipation Day, which is celebrating the emancipation of the slaves. But here's the thing. You can celebrate both. There's no rule that says you can't. And believe me, if you wanted to set a day forward to celebrate the emancipation of slaves, nobody, right or left, is going to have a problem with that. None at all. The problem is you're specifically trying to virtue signal and trying to drum up people and say, look at how progressive we are. We're getting rid of that day to celebrate that evil racist slave owner, Thomas Jefferson. And what we're going to do is we're going to bring in this new holiday about the emancipation of slaves. Look, you can do both. In fact, the emancipation of slaves is something that Thomas Jefferson himself would have celebrated, and we'll get to that in just a second. But people get Thomas Jefferson so wrong on this. Jefferson was not a pro-slavery figure. In fact, I would contend that the only two founders that may be more anti-slavery than Jefferson is Franklin and Rush. And the only reason I say that is because not only were they very critical of it in their personal writings, but they also founded the first abolitionist society. But the truth is, I don't even know that necessarily makes Franklin and Rush more anti-slavery than Jefferson was. He was one of the most anti-slavery of all the founders. And there's a couple things I'd like to point to. First of all, Thomas Jefferson tried to free his own slaves. Now, actually, ironically enough, it is George Washington that is part of the reason that he wasn't able to free his slaves. Because originally, the way that the law stood in the state of Virginia was you can't free dowry slaves, but if you desire your slaves to be free upon your death, that is acceptable. And so you can free your slaves if you want to when you die. And that's exactly what Washington did. He freed his slaves, or at least as many of them that weren't dowry slaves, and dowry slaves are ones that are inherited by your wife. So when he married Martha, he inherited some slaves from her side of the family, and so he couldn't give those slaves their freedom, but he did give other slaves his freedom that he owned. So Washington did that upon his death. And when that happened, the state of Virginia reacted directly to that and said, yeah, we're just going to have people not able to free their slaves at all unless they're completely free of debt. Well, what happens when Thomas Jefferson dies? He tries to free his slaves, but the law of Virginia wouldn't allow him to do so upon his death because the man was over $2 million in debt. And we could go through the history of his debt about how he inherited a lot of that from his father and his father-in-law and how that may have not necessarily even really been his fault. Regardless of all that, the point still stands that Thomas Jefferson wanted to free his slaves, expressed that desire on multiple occasions, tried to free his slaves upon his death, and the state of Virginia's law did not allow him to do so. And so you've already got somebody that did the best that he could and tried to free his slaves but was not able to. And then you also have to look back. Thomas Jefferson passed anti-slavery measures when he was a member of the House in the state of Virginia and went to court on 3 separate occasions to try to get slavery overturned and get it outlawed. Once in the state of Virginia, once at the federal level, and then once again in France. He was even trying to get slavery undone in other countries. That's how anti-slavery this guy was. And while he was president, he tried to get anti-slavery measures through. This guy understood that it was wrong to enslave another person and to have him work for you without compensating him. Have him work for you without his consent, to violate his free will and force him to do something on your behalf. Jefferson understood that was wrong, and we should expect nothing less from the man who said, all men are created equal. And by the way, you will notice in that original draft of the Declaration that I just read, his original draft of the Declaration of Independence, if you'll look at the very first page, you'll notice that in that line where he says all men are created equal, if you were to look at the original Declaration of Independence, it says that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. That's not what Jefferson's draft says. It says that all men are created equal and independent. Jefferson understood that slavery was wrong. And he made that case. That was part of his life's work to make sure that the slaves were freed. And when his legislation didn't pass to end slavery, he gave a scathing retort of those that wanted to keep slavery intact. And he lost by 1 vote. And he said, "Oh, to God that I would have been able to change 1 heart." And then also said, and you're probably familiar with this part of the quote, you just don't understand the context of it. He said, "I tremble for my country when I remember that God is just and that his justice will not sleep forever." that was in reference to slavery. He was saying that what we are doing is against God, and God will punish us if we don't knock it off. And of course, we know that he was right. The bloodiest war in American history, the Civil War, took place in large part, not exclusively, but in large part because of slavery. And so Jefferson's prediction came true, and he saw it coming. He understood that God was going to punish us for engaging in the sin of enslaving another human being. And by the way, just to put the last nail in the coffin to any of these ideas that Jefferson was not anti-slavery, let's look back at part of the Declaration of Independence draft that I just read. That is the wrong graphic. Oh well, hang on just a second here. I'll just, sorry, I had a graphic up, but I'm just going to read the prevalent part here. Now, I want to point something out here. And I will point to it whenever I come to it. This is obviously not an original copy of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. I mean, you can see it's printed out on computer paper. But I've seen it. Not in person, I've seen a photo of it. But I've seen Jefferson's original draft. And you notice that when he comes to this paragraph, there is a change in the way that he writes. Jefferson doesn't capitalize things much. In fact, he doesn't even capitalize the first letter of most of his sentences, which the grammar rules were a little different back then. But even whole paragraphs, he does not start with a capital letter. And yet, looking at this particular paragraph of his original draft of the Declaration of Independence, you can see very clearly he starts capitalizing things, even writing things in all caps and bolding them, using extra ink. This was the part of the Declaration that he was most fervent about. So I'll go ahead and read this. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation hither. So he's saying it's wrong that King George is taking people who have never offended him, never done anything wrong, never taken his property or committed any crimes, that he is stealing them away, taking them away from their homes, bringing them into bondage in another hemisphere, or to die on the slave ship on the way over. So he's calling out the king on being a supporter of slavery. And he continues on. This practical warfare in operabrum of infidel powers. Now he sort of bears down on his pen here in infidel. You see, what he's doing is he is calling the King of England a heathen for doing this. When he's referring to him as an infidel, he's saying, this man is not a Christian. This man doesn't live the principles of Jesus Christ. That's what it meant to call someone an infidel. Infidel powers is the warfare of the Christian in all caps, Christian king of Great Britain. In other words, he's saying, how dare you call yourself a Christian and continue to support slavery? And it continues on, determined to keep an open market where men is in all caps, should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce. Now, what does execrable mean? It comes from the root word excrement, meaning feces. So, I mean, it's not exactly a cuss word or anything, not that I think that Jefferson would have condoned that anyway, but he's saying that this commerce basically is human feces. That's how strongly he felt about this. And notice that what he is being critical of specifically is legislation that was anti-slavery. There were two states, Rhode Island and Massachusetts, that tried to outlaw slavery completely. And then you also had a couple of other colonies that were trying to pass anti-slavery measures to kind of phase slavery out. So at that time, 4 colonies trying to get rid of slavery, the king quashed all of them. He said, nope, we're a part of the British Empire. You are a British colony. Therefore, you will engage in slavery. You cannot outlaw slavery. Every British citizen has a right to own slaves if they want to. That was the king's rationale. And Jefferson is saying that policy is crap. I mean, that's literally what he's saying in his response to King George quashing any efforts to try to end slavery over here in America. And he continues on, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye, he is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us, and to purchase that liberty which he has deprived them, and murdering the people upon whom he has also obtruded them, thus paying off the forms committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. And by the way, both liberty and lives in that statement is in bold in Jefferson's original draft. So what's important to understand about that is that Jefferson's complaint here is, so the king created a huge human rights violation by going over there, by kidnapping people, and by bringing them over into slavery in this country. And now what he is doing is he is promising freedom to those people by saying, oh, we'll grant you your freedom if you fight for us and kill the people over here in America. If you join forces with us, we'll grant you your freedom. So he's the one that kept this policy in practice. He's the one that started this. And now he's using the very slaves that he himself enslaved to fight his enemies for him, paying off the debt that he owes one person at the expense of American lives. He's saying they should have never been in bondage in the first place, but you put them in bondage, and you're saying the only way that they can escape it is if they fight for you against Americans. And so you understand why Jefferson was pretty hot under the collar by all this. But what that does, and it finally puts the nail in the coffin, it really proves the point here, that Jefferson was about as anti-slavery as any founder. And was anti-slavery even in comparison to people that came much later. He was even more of an abolitionist, I would say, than a young Abraham Lincoln, who became much more against slavery the older he got. But Jefferson was very vehemently against slavery, and the fact that people nowadays don't understand that just absolutely blows my mind, that they think of him as being a pro-slavery figure. There's absolutely no truth to it. And unfortunately, this kind of dangerous revisionist history thinking has crept into the minds and hearts of other people as well. And it really, really is a shame. So just as another example of this, now I don't care about this story per se. I care about the reaction to the story and what it represents. You probably have heard by now that Colin Kaepernick, who is the former quarterback for the San Francisco? Yeah, the San Francisco 49ers. Not an NFL fan. I'm a baseball guy. Sorry if I offended anyone with that, but I have no idea. But yeah, San Francisco 49ers, I believe, is the team that he used to play for. And anyway, of course, got famous for doing the flag protests and everything. So there was a line of Nikes, and remember that Kaepernick became one of Nike's poster children, one of their big celebrity endorsements. Why, I don't know. His impressive on the field, his performance on the field wasn't all that impressive, so I'm not sure why Nike would want to associate him with their pinnacle of athleticism or whatever. It seems like they would go with a more successful quarterback, but whatever. I'm not a mover and shaker at Nike. I don't make those kind of decisions. So anyway, Colin Kaepernick got wind of a shoe design that had the Betsy Ross flag on the back of it. So the original flag with 13 stars arranged in a circle. We're all familiar with it. And got very upset about this and quashed plans, saying that the Betsy Ross flag specifically was offensive. And there's a reason that this revisionist history is incredibly dangerous, but I did want to, before we go any further, it turns out that the Betsy Ross flag shoe actually violates the flag code. So I know that that's going to upset some people, but I'm not really all that upset by the flag shoe being taken off the market because it violates the flag code anyway. And it's not like I was going to buy the Nike, so really it's no skin off my hide, which is part of the reason that you understand why I'm saying I don't really care about the shoe all that much. I really don't. If it were not for everybody reacting to the story, I doubt I would have even brought it up even on the 4th of July special here. But the thing is, this does prove a point. That when Colin Kaepernick was kneeling during the anthem and constantly said, and you heard this over and over again, and myself and a lot of other people said, yeah, I don't believe that for a second, but we didn't really have proof of it, where he kept saying that, look, it's not about the anthem, it's not about the country, it's not about the flag, I'm just trying to protest here. Yeah, well, if that's the case, then why are you offended by a shoe that has a picture of the flag on it? If it's not about the flag, and it's not about the anthem, and it's not about hating your country, then why is it the mere sight of a flag is enough to offend you? It is about the flag. And Kaepernick was full of crap to say that from the beginning, and people understood that if they weren't, just rabid Kaepernick fans, which I don't understand why you would be a rabid Kaepernick fan, but whatever. The guy was a bench rider for most of his career, but nonetheless, still better quarterback than I'll ever be, but but the thing that bothers me about this isn't so much Kaepernick himself, it's the reaction to it. And this goes to a deeper problem of trying to tarnish the flag and tarnish the history behind the flag. Now, here's the thing. We didn't even have a standardized flag until I think the Woodrow Wilson administration, maybe even a little later. It may have been FDR when we were entering World War II. We didn't even really have a standardized flag, and I'm not somebody that thinks that the flag is so sacred that you can never change it or give any criticism to it because it's gone through a lot of transformations. I'm a fan of the flag. I have a giant flag in my living room. I've got my Captain America shield right behind me. You guys know that I'm patriotic, and I have the American flag on a lot of my clothing, a lot of my hats. You can look through my old videos and see all of them. I'm a big fan of the flag. But what I have a much bigger problem with is not even dishonoring the flag. It's that people are dishonoring and starting to dishonor the principles that underlie the flag. That's what I really have an issue with. And that's really what's under attack right now. And if you don't believe me, here's a clip of a guy named, what's his name? This is a video of a professor at Georgetown who, and I'll remember his name here in a second. He's a guest on MSNBC, and he's talking about the whole Kaepernick flag controversy. And like I said, the reaction to the Kaepernick story is actually far more interesting than the original story itself. Take a listen.
But can you explain why this particular flag, this symbol, is so offensive to some?
Right. Well, it hails from the revolutionary period, of course, of this nation's founding, which was deeply embroiled in, enslavement of the owners of slaves, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and the like. But also, it's the recent use of this flag that has been most opprobrious. Right-wing white supremacists have used it as a rallying cry for their own cause. And none of these flags are kind of set in stone, right? It's depending upon the culture in which you live, the moral ecology of the time. So right now, this flag has been used by people who want to pummel African Americans, Latinx, Jews, and other people, neo-Nazis who want to claim that they have their true copyright on American identity. So why not choose a flag that is representative of everybody, the diversity of identities, ideologies, and people of color and mainstream people who happen to exist in this country? That's the kind of blowback against the use of this particular flag.
All right, so a couple of things that we do want to bring up here. First of all, this guy's a professor at Georgetown and doesn't seem to know basic history about the Revolution. Because if you understand anything about the Constitution, about the founders, and we just showed you in the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, one of the motivating factors, particularly from the northern states, but even from some southerners, like Thomas Jefferson, to try to fight the Revolution in the first place, was that they recognized that slavery was wrong. Several states were trying to end slavery, And British Parliament and the British Crown came down on them and said, nope, can't limit slavery. So he's got his history completely backwards, completely misunderstands the Revolution, misunderstands the constitutional period. But even if that weren't the case, let's look a little bit deeper into this. Let's look at his claim specifically. Which white supremacists are using the Betsy Ross flag? I'm not saying it's never happened, I'm just saying I've never seen it. And I pay pretty close attention to the news. I have seen white supremacists use the rebel flag, seen that before. I've seen white supremacists even use other Confederate flags, not the rebel flag, which, by the way, was never the national flag of the Confederacy, but that's a discussion for another day. I've seen them use those, and I've seen them use other symbols. Never once seen a KKK member or a white nationalist, never seen them use a Betsy Ross flag. Not saying it's never happened, just saying I have never seen it before. And so I'm really confused as to, I think what is going on is that he has made a unfortunate mistake that a lot of people make in any kind of political debate, which is they made up their mind what they want the answer to be, and then they're trying to craft their message to fit the answer. In other words, he wants to support Colin Kaepernick. He wants Colin Kaepernick to be right, and so he's trying to skew his story to try to explain how Colin Kaepernick is right to think that this is offensive. And that seems to be what is going on here, but I really don't remember ever seeing a white supremacist using specifically the Betsy Ross flag. And more importantly, and I think that this is the more prevalent argument here, does this apply to any symbol? Seriously, does it apply to any symbol? Could, for example, a hate group adopt the Superman logo and make that just because one white supremacist happened to be wearing, for example, a Superman shirt at a rally somewhere? Does that automatically, because it has been used by a white supremacist now, is it now tainted and nobody can ever use that symbol again? See, what's hilarious to me is that people on the left will say, well, you shouldn't get offended at a Che Guevara shirt, or you shouldn't get offended at the sickle and hammer flag, under which millions of people have been systematically starved, and that was the official flag of the government at the time. But you should be offended by this flag. Now, have atrocities been committed by the government under that flag? Sure. But not to that level. And what's hilarious to me is they have a complete double standard about that. They'll say the sickle and hammer flag, where you systematically starved, 6 to 10 million people in the course of 2 or 3 years, and closer to 20 or 30 million over the entire course of the USSR, that flag's okay. You shouldn't be offended by that flag. You ought to be offended by the Betsy Ross Revolution flag. Now, was slavery... I'm not trying to make excuses for slavery. I know that people are going to take this out of context. But here's the thing. The modified version of the Betsy Ross flag was the same flag that was flying over the Union Army when that took place and the slaves were liberated. So where are you going with this? Here's the thing. I do know for a fact, because I've seen pictures of it, that Klan members have used the American flag in their rallies. And I'm talking about the modern American flag. So does that now mean that the American flag is now tainted and nobody can ever use it again? Nobody can honor it again? If you play these people's logic out, if you lead it to its logical conclusion that, well, once a white supremacist has used it, it's tainted, we can't use it anymore, sorry, then that means that the white supremacist is the one that has the ultimate power. The white supremacists, the Nazis, the hate groups, that they only have to use a symbol once and then it's tainted forever, we can never use it again. You see how insane that is? Because that gives them all the power. That means the most radical amongst us, those are the ones that now have the ultimate power in deciding what symbols are okay and which symbols are not. You're giving them the keys to the kingdom by doing that. And that's what I find so incredibly disturbing about this, and really what it all boils down to, and he kind of hints at it in his talk there in the clip, is that this is the subjective morality interpretation. There is no right or wrong. You heard him say in that clip that these things are not set in stone, and it's basically just based on how the person feels when they see it. Well, somebody's going to be offended by anything. For example, I am offended by the sickle and hammer flag, and I believe that I have good reason to be. But that doesn't mean that I want it censored. That doesn't mean I think that, you should infringe upon a person's right of free speech to take that flag down. It's a complete double standard, but it all stems from that idea that there are no facts, there is no right or wrong, there is not a correct or a incorrect interpretation of history or a correct or incorrect interpretation of a historic symbol like the Betsy Ross flag, that it's whatever I feel at the moment, that's what makes it what it is. You see, anytime you're in a situation like that where you're offended, it's very important for you to ask, why am I offended? Why am I offended? Because then you can do a little soul searching and do a little research and find out, okay, my offense is valid. There's a good reason that I'm offended at this. Or you may find out that, okay, I was being a little bit silly there and I really shouldn't be offended at this. I'm not saying ignore the offense. I'm just saying don't let that be the standard. Use that as a motivator to spur you on to study more to find out if that offense is valid or it's based on something that simply isn't true. And that's really where we differ. He's saying there is no truth. Whatever you feel right there at the second, that's what you need to go with. All right, so we'll go to the next clip.
What do you make of those who say, listen, why let those sort of right-wing white supremacist groups win? Why not reclaim the flag, if you will?
That would be beautiful. I don't hear anything coming from the right about that. I don't hear them going, hey, this is not.
And you think the onus is on the right to do that?
Well, yeah, because the left is responding. They're saying this flag is problematic. They're giving their interpretation. It's similar to what the Confederacy has done. They lost the war, but they won the battle of interpretation. This is waging a war of interpretation on the landscape of American popular culture for the collective mindset of America. And people have their right to weigh in as they choose. But the reality is that this flag has represented something that is offensive and opprobrious, and if people want to reclaim it, then do so.
Again, this is the real problem, is that he's once again giving the keys of the kingdom over to the white supremacists and the radicals. Because he's saying they can reappropriate any symbol that they want to, and then it is incumbent on other people to reclaim it. And by the way, speaking of that, I have seen quite a few Betsy Ross flags at Tea Party rallies. I've seen quite a few Betsy Ross flags at different conservative events. Again, never seen one used by a white supremacist. Not saying it's never happened, just saying I've never seen it. And so, where is he getting off this idea that the right isn't reclaiming it? And even if they didn't, why is that the right's responsibility? If they really believed in the principles underlying the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, then why don't they reclaim it? Why don't they wear the Betsy Ross flag as a badge of honor? Which, by the way, I would be fine with. I would think that that was actually a good thing. And so, why is it incumbent upon the right? And he's saying, well, the right hasn't reclaimed it, or at least I haven't seen them reclaim it, therefore it's a tainted symbol and there's nothing you can do to redeem it. Well, that's ridiculous. And by the way, there are tons of people on the right that have specifically denounced white supremacy. People like me, people like Ben Shapiro, who was the #1 target of white supremacists in the 2016 election cycle. People like Steven Crowder, Glenn Beck, Mark Levin, who, by the way, is also Jewish. I mean, I could go down the list. I don't have enough time in this broadcast to go through all the mentions of denouncing white supremacy by prominent conservative figures, many of whom are minority status. And so this idea that, well, I haven't seen the right reclaim it. Well, I didn't think that we had to reclaim it because, again, I haven't seen the white supremacists using it in that way in the first place. But even so, if you want the symbol reclaimed, why don't you reclaim it? Which I would be fine with. The flag is for everybody. It's a symbol that is specifically for everyone. And so, if that's the case, then why not? But here's the thing. He's basically trying to say, well, the right isn't correctly denouncing white supremacists. What about Antifa? We're only, 6 days away from when Antifa violently attacked a conservative and bashed his head in. Actually caused a brain bleed. And he wasn't the only one that got hurt. Antifa has a long history of violence, not just in modern history, but also in their origins back in Germany. And so when we're looking at this, the Antifa groups, is this now the standard that we're going to have? If the Antifa group, for example, starts using the Planned Parenthood symbol or the symbol of the Democrat Party, the little donkey logo, if one member of Antifa uses it, is that now a tainted symbol? You can never use it, and if you do use it, you're a hate monger that wants to hurt people? Because that seems to be the standard that the left is putting up now, and if you put up that standard for other people, you got to live by it yourself. I would caution you against saying things like that. I would caution you against having that stance, because it'll come back to bite you in the butt if you're not careful with it. And I think that another important point here is that notice that he's basically admitting that the left, they have absolutely no desire to reclaim the flag. He's saying, no, that's the right's job. The right should be reclaiming the flag. Well, why not you? It's your flag too. You're an American. This is part of your history. Why don't you have any desire to reclaim the flag? By the way, I don't think the flag even needs reclaiming. I don't think it was ever tainted in the first place. But if you believe that, and this guy seems to, then why is it not incumbent upon you to lead that charge? I'm not saying you should do it alone. I'm not saying that I wouldn't help you out with that. But if you really believe that the flag needs reclaiming, then why aren't you the first one up to the plate to say, yep, we need to reclaim it? Why are you saying that's their thing? Because the truth is they don't want to reclaim the flag. They want the average person to think of American history and the American Revolution as something that belongs in the dustbin of history, something that is not worth saving. They don't want the original intent. They don't want the Declaration of Independence. They don't want the Constitution. They don't want the flag. They want to burn it all down and start over. They want a Soviet-style communist revolution. That's the end goal. I don't know if this person specifically believes that, but this prevailing culture that the left has created of general pessimism towards all of American history, where people only focus on the bad things, only focus on the negative parts of American history and American culture, and think of it as this place that is built on the back of hatred and racism. That's the goal. Their long-term goal is to alienate us from our principles so that we will be easier to mold into the socialist utopia that they envision. That's what it boils down to. And it's terrifying. Let's go to the third clip, because this really solidifies that point.
Yeah, because, words matter, symbols matter too. Why don't we wear a swastika for July 4th? Because, I don't know, it makes a difference. The cross burning on somebody's lawn. Why don't we just have a Nike, celebration of the cross? Well, because those symbols are symbols of hate. So we can take PC culture back. It's amazing to me the people who cry the loudest about PC are the ones who didn't show up when the offense first occurred, who didn't defend the people who were victims of white supremacy or racism or sexism or misogyny, but now pop up and say, hey, let's not be too PC. If you ain't fought the battle, if you haven't celebrated the process, you can't acclaim the product. So at this point, I think people need to be honest about it and say, it's not a matter of PC. There are many people within communities of color who understand complexity, complication. You can't have it the way you want it. But something so glaring and so apparent, that has to be dealt with.
So again, that just proves my point. Because what he's trying to do there is he's saying, let's use the Betsy Ross flag, or let's use a swastika or a burning cross. See, he's trying to taint the flag as much as possible. He's trying to make people think that the flag itself is a racist symbol, just like the swastika, just like the burning cross, that those things are on an even playing field. And I want you to notice the progression that is happening here. I want you to notice how we've moved. Because originally, and I'm not talking about decades ago, I'm talking about like a few years ago, what we were saying is, if you go after the symbol itself, if you're saying that the symbol is the problem and there's no nuance and anybody using the symbol must automatically be a bad person, and you don't take time to delve into it and understand what's actually being talked about here, than taking away, for example, the Confederate statues or the rebel flag or even Confederate national flags, that you want to tear all that down. The next step will be they'll go after America. They'll go after the founders. And they said, no, that's crazy. Nobody's going to do that. We're not talking about getting rid of Jefferson Memorial, even though people have proposed it. We're not talking about the American flag, except they are now going after the Betsy Ross American flag. So originally, they weren't trying to take away the Confederate flag. Then they were, but they were not trying to take away the American flag, the flags of the American Revolution. Now they're getting rid of that one. Where's the next step? There's nowhere left to go. The only place left for them to go is to go after the modern American flag. That's a symbol of hatred. That is a symbol of racism. There are people that are already saying that right now. The left has originally didn't believe these things. Now they're moving into that phase. They're slowly creeping up on it, and before you know it, the American flag itself is going to be racist. Because originally it was just the Confederate flag, just the rebel flag, then the Confederate flags, then the Gadsden flag, because that was a symbol of the Revolution. Now they moved on to the Betsy Ross American flag. Before you know it, it's going to be the 50-star state flag. That is going to be the next target. We've slowly moved up this hill, and now the progressives are ready to hit the American flag, the modern American flag. That's what they've been moving up to this entire time. Kaepernick just happened to be a little bit ahead of the curve on this one. But nonetheless, this is what he's trying to do. He's trying to say that the Revolution and Betsy Ross, that's all equivalent to Nazi Germany. It's all the same thing. It's on the same playing field. There's no difference. He's trying to desensitize people to thinking of those in similar terms or being on the same plane of existence. They're not. There's nothing further from the truth. The American Revolution was about liberty, about liberating all people, including slaves, about all men being created equal. Nazi Germany was about the opposite of that, enslaving people, taking over countries, imperialism. That was not the goal of the revolution, never was. The goal of the revolution was, leave us alone, we don't want to be dealt with like this. The Nazis were the opposite. We will take over the world and we will deal with other people the way we want them dealt with. And so it's the exact opposite idea, but he's trying to couch it as though it's the same thing. And really what's sad about this is the new standard is, I'm offended, therefore the symbol itself must be bad. But that's why it's so important for us to ask why you're offended. For example, originally, Frederick Douglass was somebody who, on a pretty regular basis as an abolitionist, talked about how evil and racist and how much of a pro-slavery document the Constitution was. And then he read the Constitution and said, I was wrong. He read the Constitution and said, this is an anti-slavery document. I thought it was pro-slavery. But what's actually happening is the people in America right now are not living by the Declaration of Independence, are not living by the Constitution. And that's the reason that we've got all these problems. That's the reason that slavery still exists, because they aren't doing what they promised to do in the original intent. And so it changed his perspective, which is the reason that I say, if you are offended, it's time for you to ask why and do your own research, because Frederick Douglass found out, I got it wrong this whole time. I was incorrect. And by the way, on this idea that the symbol is the problem, this is the issue that actually bothers me. This is the part of the story that actually bothers me, that there is a concerted effort to rewrite history. And if you want to know how recent a history we're talking about, I want to show you this graphic that features the Betsy Ross flag on Inauguration Day. So you'll notice there's actually a couple different flag designs. In the center, you have the modern American flag, and then you've got a modified version over on the right and left, and then on the far part, you have the original Betsy Ross flag. That's not Trump's inauguration. Look down at the bottom. Who's that guy there getting inaugurated? Oh, right, this is Barack Obama's second inauguration. President Barack Obama used the Betsy Ross flag in his inauguration. which, by the way, is totally appropriate. Nothing in the world wrong with that. But the point is, the left is constantly changing its standards. So Barack Obama was using a symbol of white supremacy. You're really asking us to buy into that. You see how fast this Overton window moves? You see how quickly they're getting rid of symbols and calling you a racist if you use one of them? They are constantly changing their standards. They are constantly reinventing the rules, moving the goalpost, and it's not going to do them any good. It's not going to take them anywhere good, because if you don't have any kind of solid principles to stand on, you're eventually going to fall down. You've got to have some solid ground to stake your claim. You've got to have some solid ground, something that you believe in to stand on. They believe whatever I feel that day. That's what I believe in. That's not a standard that's going to lead anywhere good. You see, it's sad, but there is a concerted effort to teach people that liberty and capitalism and the American way of life and the American culture are actually evil, just so their political agenda, their personal policy items become easier for them to pass. They don't mind burning the entire system down. They don't mind throwing all of it away because they don't see it as something worth saving. And that's the problem, because America absolutely, beyond the shadow of a doubt, is worth saving. So let's go ahead and go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Today's Chaplain Report, we are going to do something special for the 4th of July. And I thought that this was incredibly appropriate, especially if you understand some of the symbolism behind it. We're going to go ahead and go straight to the great lawgiver, Moses, in the book of Exodus. In Exodus 6, verses 5 through 6. Furthermore, I have heard the groaning of the sons of Israel, because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage. And I have remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the sons of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from the bondage, from their bondage. I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. Now, one of the things that I want you to understand about this, because this is Independence Day, and the word independence, of course, comes from being not dependent, the opposite of dependent, on another person. In other words, having liberty. You see, a slave has all of his basic needs met. And the reason that he has his basic needs met is because if not, then the master, the slave owner, just same Egypt, America, wherever it is, doesn't matter the time, he's going to take care of at least the very basic needs, because he wants the slave to be able to continue to work for him. And so a slave is not only without liberty, he is also dependent on the slave master for everything. You see, what God's talking about here in Exodus, and what he's explaining to Moses, is he says, I am going to be the one that brings liberty. I am going to stretch forth my hand, and I am going to, with my judgment, in other words, what is he implying? That what Egypt is doing is wrong. That what Egypt is doing by keeping men in bondage against their will, especially keeping them from worshiping their God, that Egypt doing that is going to be met with retribution. That God's anger is not going to be inept. That God's anger is not going to be withheld. That God is going to bring judgment upon Egypt, and the result of that judgment is Israel gets to go free. He's giving Moses the game plan right out of the gate. And you'll notice that the way that he words it here is that in the latter part of that, that he's going to deliver from their bondage and redeem you with an outstretched arm. So this idea of redemption, it's the same word that we hear over and over again when talking about our sin. Why? Because we are slaves to sin. We have fallen into an evil, horrible situation, in our case of our own making, when we're talking about sin. And it is God that goes out and pays the price to bring us out of that bondage. In the case of modern Christendom, of course, that price was the blood of Jesus Christ. In the time of Israel, that redemption was a physical redemption, not a spiritual one. He's talking about right here redeeming them in a physical way, bringing them out of physical bondage into a land where they can prosper. But I want you to notice something about that and remember that a little bit later in the same passage, that when the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, is asking why he's supposed to let these people go, the response by God is, so that they can serve me. You see, this liberty was free, but there was an expectation that followed it. It doesn't mean that it cost Israel something, in the sense that they couldn't have paid that. They couldn't have paid enough to redeem themselves from the grasp of Egypt. But there was an expectation that they were going to use that newfound freedom, they were going to use that liberty to obey God and to give sacrifice to Him and to do His commandments and live as godly people. That's why He made the covenant to them right after they came out of bondage on Sinai. He gave them the laws and said, if you will live by these laws, you will be my people, I will be your God, and I will bless you, and I'll take care of you. Israel didn't always hold up their end of the bargain, and I actually think it's kind of ironic that we've been studying Daniel and him talking about them breaking that covenant in our other series that's going on. It just happened to hit around the 4th of July. But in this passage that we're looking at from Exodus, you'll notice that throughout the entire narrative of Exodus, there is this idea that God is the bringer of liberty and freedom, but He does so with the expectation that you have a duty that corresponds with that. Here's your freedom. What are you going to do with it? Make the right decision. That's how God treats it. He doesn't force anybody to obey Him. He could have done that, but He doesn't. He could have made Israel all obey Him, but He doesn't do that. He gave them their liberty and said, okay, here's your freedom. You have a responsibility now to use it responsibly. Sometimes they didn't. But the point is, He gave them the freedom to do it. He gave them the freedom to make that choice one way or the other. And when they made the right choice, He rewarded them. When they made the wrong choice, He corrected them. And it's the exact same choice that we have now. It's really no different. I mean, the covenant is different. The terms are different. But the expectation is the same. God comes with the free gift of Jesus Christ's blood to redeem us from the bondage of our sins. And then says, here's your liberty. You're free from sin. What are you going to do with it? And don't we see that as a country when we celebrate this day of freedom and liberty? There are people that use liberty irresponsibly. There are people that use liberty to do terrible things. But there are also people that use it to really, really good things. I'm a living example of that. And I'm talking about on the receiving end, not the giving end. I wish I was better at giving. People that have helped me out with my career and more importantly, when I got sick with cancer, there are people that have done so much good to me because of the liberty that they were afforded. And because of that, I have a responsibility to use my liberty responsibly and to help others as well. And that's the exact call that we are given as Christians. God gives us freedom from this burden of sin, this freedom to do what we're actually supposed to do. And He says, here it is. Please use it responsibly. Please do the right thing. And then instructs us on how to do that. You see, in a lot of ways, the relationship that God had with Israel isn't really that much different than the relationship that He has with us now. A lot of the terms are different. A lot of the details are different. But at the end of the day, it all comes back to, here's your freedom, use it responsibly, make the right decisions, live the way that I teach you to live, and you'll be rewarded for it. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2019.